He was just an engineer from Detroit. No rank, no influence, his hands smelling of oil. When the generals ridiculed his idea, he decided to prove them wrong. What happened next forced the U.S. command to rewrite its own orders. I was just trying to stop good men from dying in bad machines. But you say that out loud in the U.S. Army in 1942, and suddenly you're the problem. That was me, Walter Hicks. No uniform, no salute, no stars on my collar. Just calloused hands, a Detroit work ethic, and a pile of rejected blueprints that could have saved lives. I wasn't there to play soldier. I was there to make damn sure the tanks we sent across the Atlantic didn't fall apart before they got out of the mud. But let me tell you how that went. It started with a test. Aberdeen proving ground, cold gray sky, mud thick enough to pull your boots clean off. They brought out a brand new Sherman, gleaming like a showroom Cadillac. And I already hated it. See, I knew that tank better than the men who signed off on it. I'd seen what happened to its engine after 30 minutes in sand. I'd studied the track wear. I'd crawled under the belly and tapped the steel like a doctor checks reflexes. And I knew one thing for sure. That tank was going to get somebody killed. So I spoke up. "Colonel," I said, pointing to the armor plate under the turret, "if a Panzer puts one round right here, that hatch will pop like a soda cap." He smirked. "Mr. Hicks, we appreciate your concerns, but the Army has full confidence in the M4. That's Army speak for. Sit down, civilian. I kept talking anyway. That was my first mistake. I filed reports, diagrams, stress tests, comparative data. I showed him how the drivetrain overheated after long hauls, how the transmission locked up on hills. I even ran side-by-side tests with a modified suspension system I built in my garage. It doubled the terrain clearance. But guess what? They didn't care. Not one bit. Too expensive, they said. Too slow to implement. We already have a contract. Let me translate that for you. We don't want to look wrong. Then came the meeting. Long table, uniforms with medals they earned 10 desks away from danger. I walked in with a rolled blueprint and oil on my knuckles. Every face looked up like I'd tracked mud onto their nice clean rug. "Mr. Hicks," one of them said, flipping through my report like a menu, "we're fighting a war. We need volume, not perfection." I leaned forward. "Then tell that to the men who gotta climb inside this thing and fight." Silence. I knew right then. I wasn't part of their team. I was a glitch in their machine, and machines don't like glitches. 3 days later, they pulled my access badge, said I was undermining morale, said I was being disruptive to chain of command. Funny how pointing out deadly flaws becomes a threat to national security. But they didn't stop there. They told me I couldn't be on site anymore, that I was to cease all contact with active engineering personnel, that my designs were no longer under consideration. I stood there outside the gate, toolbox in one hand, prototype documents in the other, while a young private tried not to look me in the eye as he closed the chain-link fence. You ever been right too early? That's the loneliest kind of right. On the train ride home, I sat across from a man in uniform, sergeant, infantry division. Couldn't have been more than 23. Clean shave, eyes like he hadn't slept since boot camp. We got to talking. He asked what I did. I told him I worked on tanks. His face lit up, said he was headed overseas, said he was assigned to Shermans, said he was glad they were solid machines. I didn't have the heart to tell him the truth. But I did slip one of my modification notes into his duffel bag when he wasn't looking. You never know. I got back to Detroit the next week. Cold steel, hot coffee, and the kind of silence that fills up when you've got nothing left to say. I went back to the factory. Punch clock, wipe sweat. No more field tests, no more army brass. Just me, the machines, and a fire in my chest that wouldn't burn out. I tried to let it go. I did. But then the letters started coming in. From soldiers, from families, from crewmen who said, "We lost another one to a jammed gearbox." From widows who asked, was it true the tank couldn't reverse fast enough? One mother wrote, he was only 19. They said the armor failed. I sat with that letter all night. No one wants to be right like that. But the part that still gets me, they called me dangerous, not because I lied, but because I wouldn't. I showed them a better way. They showed me the door. And I'm not the only one. Plenty of folks in that war did the right thing at the wrong time and got burned for it. This wasn't just my fight. It was every man who ever saw disaster coming and got told to shut up. But trust me, what happened next? That changed everything. You do not want to miss what came after. I wasn't out of the fight, not by a long shot. They took my badge. They shut me out the front gate. So I walked in through the loading dock. You think an army base runs on medals and protocol? No, sir. It runs on coffee, crates, and the men moving them. After they kicked me out, I went home. But home ain't much when your mind's still stuck in Maryland mud. I couldn't sleep, couldn't let it go. Every letter I got from the front, every engine failure, every burned-out transmission, read like a death sentence with my name in the margins. So I packed my drafts, kissed my girl on the cheek, and got on the next bus to Pennsylvania. Not for the army, for the factories. See, the army may have turned me out, but the people building the war machine, the welders, the linemen, the mechanics, they still listened. And that's where the real power lived. I showed up at the Pittsburgh Ordnance Depot with nothing but a clipboard and a tool belt. Didn't even have a pass, but the guards knew me. Word had gotten around. That's the engineer they dumped from Aberdeen, one of 'em whispered. The one with the better gearbox, said the other. Turns out getting kicked out was the best PR I ever got. Within hours, I was sitting on a steel drum next to Harold Jenkins. 30 years on the line, hands like cinder blocks, voice like gravel. "Walter," he said, lighting a cigarette with the end of a blowtorch, "you tell me how to stop these tanks from stalling in the mud, and I'll make sure the next 10 off the line don't." Just like that, I was back in business. We worked night shifts. Unofficial, unpaid, unseen, grease-stained blueprints passed hand to hand like sacred scripture. I rewired fans. Harold rebuilt housing for the transmission. We drilled, bolted, tested, with no permission, no funding, no approval. Every part we modified. We documented. Every test run, we filmed. The equipment guys even rigged up a dummy Panzer turret and fired on a reinforced plate we'd welded from scrap. It held, and nobody in uniform wanted to hear about it. One afternoon, a colonel came by unannounced. Clipboard, shiny boots. Didn't like the look of me with a welder's mask. "You're Hicks," he said flatly. "Yes, sir." "You're not authorized to touch government equipment." "That's funny," I said. "Neither is gravity, but it still does damage." He didn't laugh. "They tried to shut us down again, this time through paperwork. Suddenly the plant had a compliance audit. Jenkins got pulled into meetings. I got flagged as non-cooperative. But we weren't alone anymore. The crew stood up. Not one or two guys, all of them. Black, white, union, non-union, didn't matter. Welders with busted knees, operators with grease under every fingernail. They said if Hicks goes, they all go. Management backed off, quietly, carefully. A week later, I got a call. Not from the Army. From a young lieutenant stationed out in California, working on amphibious landing craft. Said he'd read one of my early reports. Said he had issues with the same engine problems I'd flagged in the Shermans. "Sir," he said, "they won't listen to me either, but I've got a machine shop and clearance." I flew out the next day on a borrowed plane seat. Didn't even pack socks. That's how it spread. Not through the ranks, through the cracks. We weren't an army. We were a resistance made of steel, sweat, and shared frustration. I kept a journal back then. Just short notes. Here's one from December 9th, 1942. No medals for what we're doing, but maybe fewer funerals. One night I was sitting in a warehouse in Chicago talking with a young Mexican mechanic named Carlos. Smart kid, quick hands, real sharp. He was adjusting the torque settings on a prototype drive shaft we'd designed from spare aircraft parts. He looked up at me and said, "You think they'll ever thank you for this?" I said, "They don't have to, long as they don't die because we stayed quiet." That warehouse, it wasn't regulation, it wasn't official, but it became the heart of everything. We called it Hangar Zero, the place the Army pretended didn't exist, while quietly letting us keep working, because deep down someone up the chain knew we were right. They couldn't say it out loud, but they didn't stop us either. By the end of the month, we had 6 modified Shermans ready for internal testing, all built unofficially, with undocumented parts, using after-hours labor and misplaced materials. But those tanks, they ran cleaner, cooler, faster. They climbed hills like mountain goats. And when we ran impact simulations on the reinforced front armor, they took hits the original model never could. We filmed it all. We kept receipts. Because we knew when the moment came they'd say it never happened. Then came the first real wall. Someone leaked our blueprints to a procurement officer in Washington. He reported us for unauthorized design alterations and potential sabotage. That's when they sent the suits. Not soldiers, inspectors. They walked in like kings, shut down our test floor, and confiscated every document they could get their hands on. Labeled it all classified and under review. Carlos got reassigned. Harold got suspended. And me, I was escorted off the property. Again. And let me tell you what hurt most. It wasn't the shutdown. It wasn't the silence from upstairs. It was watching real progress, real solutions get boxed up and buried because someone with no oil under their nails got nervous. The Army wasn't afraid our tanks would fail. They were afraid we'd prove theirs already had. That night, I sat in a diner across from the plant, staring into a cold cup of coffee while the radio played updates from North Africa. Words like casualties, mechanical failure, retreat. And I knew some of those boys died in machines I tried to fix, machines they wouldn't let me touch. I got up, paid the bill, and walked out into the night. I wasn't finished. This is the turning point. Everything that mattered, all the resistance, the risk, the pushback, it all comes to a head next. Stick around. This story's just getting started. What would you do if you were Ray? When the system is deaf and mistakes cost lives, it is impossible to remain silent. If you care about stories like this, subscribe to our channel. Here, we highlight what usually remains behind the scenes of war. Write in the comments, who do you think really changes the course of history? generals or those whose names are not heard from the podium. They thought they shut it down. They thought one round of suits and sealed boxes would be enough to kill it. But ideas don't die just because someone locked a filing cabinet. And I don't scare that easy. 2 weeks after they boxed up Hangar 0, I got a letter. Handwritten, no return address. Just a short message. They're testing in Nevada. Bring your notes. Bring the film. Come quiet. No signature. No explanation, just a location. Now, if I had any sense left in me, I'd have tossed it in the fire and gone back to the assembly line. Pretended like this war could be won with silence and clean hands. But that's not how I was raised, and I'd already buried too many men in my mind to stop now. I took a train west, slept sitting up, ate cold sandwiches out of my coat, carried 3 reels of film, 2 sets of blueprints, and one thing more dangerous than all of it put together. Proof. The kind of proof that couldn't be ignored once it was out in the open. When I arrived, it was nothing but dust, heat, and chain-link fences. Some called it a testing site. Others called it limbo. I called it familiar. I walked straight into the hangar they'd set aside. No sign, no flag, no welcome. And there they were, Lieutenant Monroe, sharp eyes, desert tan, sleeves rolled like a man who'd rather sweat than sit. Sergeant Penner, wide as a fridge, hands like vices. Didn't say much, but never looked away. And the real surprise, Harold Jenkins. "Thought you were suspended," I said. He shrugged. "Thought you were gone." That was the kind of reunion we got in this war. Short on hugs, long on purpose. They rolled out the test unit. It looked like a Sherman from a distance, but up close. She was meaner, lower profile, reinforced armor with angled plating we'd begged them to approve, new intake system, modified gear ratio, and suspension built to hold steady on a mountain trail, not just a parade route. "She runs?" I asked. Monroe grinned. "She flies." That's when I realized what they'd done. They hadn't just kept my design alive, they'd built it. Behind closed doors, off the books. But breathing. We had 1 week. 1 week before the official team came in to assess, which meant tear it apart, file a report, and pretend it never happened. So we made that week count. Day 1, desert course, heat over 100. We ran climbs, descents, sharp turns. She took it all. No overheating, no gear lock. Day 2, ballistics. Simulated hits from standard anti-tank rifles. No breach, not even close. Day 3, maneuver drills. Compared it side by side with the Army's current model. Ours stopped faster, climbed harder, took corners tighter. Penner said, "Feels like driving a beast that knows it's too good for this world." That's when I knew we had something more than a machine. We had a statement. Then came day 5. We got word the brass was coming early. Someone tipped them off. Monroe pulled me aside. "We won't get another shot at this. If they walk in and it's just talk, they'll bury us again." "Then let's make it undeniable," I said. So we filmed everything. We mounted cameras on the armor. We wired audio to the engine. We wrote down every stat, every comparison, every screw we turned. It wasn't a test anymore. It was evidence. The morning they arrived, we were ready. 4 men in clean uniforms, white gloves, clipboards like shields. The same kind of faces that told me 2 years ago my ideas were not aligned with production needs. They circled the tank like it owed them rent. One of them, Major Lasker, tapped the reinforced plate with a pen. "Whose authorization was this?" he asked. Monroe didn't blink. "Mine." "Unacceptable," Lasker said. This deviates from approved specifications. You've taken liberties." "Those liberties," I said, stepping forward, "could be the difference between a soldier walking home or getting shipped in pieces." He looked at me like I'd tracked dust into his office. "You again." They didn't ask to see the footage, didn't ask to hear the stats. They told us to dismantle it, to cease all further testing, that it was outside the chain of command. We stood there in the silence after they left. Tank still warm from the last run. Penner said it first. "So, that's it?" I shook my head. "Not yet. That night I did something I swore I wouldn't. I called the press. Not for fame, not for revenge, but because this thing, this work, this proof was bigger than the four of us, bigger than the Army's fear of being wrong. I sent the footage to a contact at a small paper in St. Louis, gave him the specs, the timelines, the denial letters, didn't ask him to publish, just asked him to see. 3 days later, the story broke. Unofficial tank model outperforms Army standard in Nevada test. Armed forces, weekly. No names, no location, but enough detail to spark questions. And the questions burned, phone lines lit up. Congressional aides started sniffing around, even the engineers who once slammed the door on me. They started asking for copies of the blueprints. And just like that, silence turned into a sound they couldn't ignore anymore. This was it. The explosion, the culmination. Everything that came before led to this one spark, and it lit a fire even the Army couldn't stamp out. The fight isn't over, not by a mile. But now, the rules just changed. I wasn't trying to become the center of anything. But the second the press caught wind of what we'd built in that Nevada Dust Bowl, the Army's quiet little machine started leaking oil. Fast. Funny how the same people who ignored you for years suddenly want a meeting when their reputation's on the line. The first call came from an aide to someone with stars on their shoulders and a seat near Washington. He didn't say much, just that I needed to be in D.C. within 72 hours for a closed-door conversation. That's the kind of invitation you don't get twice. So I packed a bag, grabbed the original film reels, and brought my best work shirt. The one with no name tag, just a faded grease stain over the heart. Washington in '43 was a strange place for a man like me. You could feel the war in the air, thick like coal dust. Headlines screaming about Italy, about the Pacific, about sacrifice. But inside the Pentagon, it was polished shoes and polished answers. I walked in with paper cuts on my hands and scratches on my boots. They walked in with pens too clean to know the weight of a weld. The meeting room was cold. Metal chairs, long table, men with folders. Nobody smiled. That was fine. I hadn't smiled much lately either. "Mr. Hicks," one of them began, a general, I assumed by the number of decorations on his jacket. "We've reviewed your recent activity." That word, activity. They made it sound like a crime. He continued. "You've conducted unauthorized tests, distributed sensitive materials, and released information to the media without clearance. That's a serious breach." I leaned forward. Calm, direct. "No, sir. What's serious is shipping boys into combat with faulty armor and calling it patriotism. That did it. Half the room looked like I'd just insulted their mothers. The other half looked like they wanted to agree, but didn't know if it was safe to. They tried to flip it back on me. "You've damaged trust within our ranks. You've undermined the procurement process. You've created a disruption in the chain of command." And my answer was the same every time. "Sir, If the chain of command is dragging its feet while men die, maybe the disruption's overdue. Eventually, they dropped the threats. Why? Because they had read the reports. The modified tank outperformed theirs in 7 key metrics. My data wasn't theory anymore. It was fact. And facts, as it turns out, don't salute. But the real twist came from a voice I hadn't expected. Brigadier General Langston, quiet until now, spoke up. He was older, black, and built like a man who earned every ounce of his authority the hard way. And when he finally looked my way, it wasn't with a glare. It was with recognition. "I've read your files, Hicks," he said. "You remind me of someone I knew in France during the last war. Had the same habit of being right before the rest of us caught up." The room froze. "Your model works," he said simply. "The question is whether we have the courage to admit we were late to the truth. You could have heard a bolt drop. After the meeting, I was told to stay in town. They needed to review options, translation. They were figuring out how to claim victory without admitting they'd been wrong. But something had shifted. Langston pulled me aside in the hallway. "You're not alone in this anymore," he said, "but you've still got to play it smart. They're not going to give you credit. They'll just try not to lose face." "Let them," I said. "I'm not here for credit." He looked at me, dead serious. "Good, because if you were, they'd bury you faster than they buried your test footage." Back at the hotel, I found a stack of letters waiting at the front desk. From factories, from soldiers, from families. They were pouring in now, people who read the story, who saw the data, who felt what we were fighting for. One came from a father whose son had just shipped out. "If your tank means he has a better chance of coming home, I hope they use every bolt of it." Another, from a woman in Akron. "My brother used to say tanks were steel coffins. Maybe now he'd say something different." That's when it hit me. This wasn't about one tank. This was about trust. The kind that had been leaking out of the war effort for months. The kind that couldn't be rebuilt with speeches or slogans, only with proof. 2 days later, they sent a memo to the press. An upgraded M4 variant is under expedited evaluation based on internal testing models. No names, no credit, no mention of Nevada. But I saw the schematics. They were mine, slightly repainted, relabeled, but mine, and I let them have it. Because the boys overseas didn't care who signed the blueprints. They cared if the thing moved when they hit the throttle and held when the bullets came flying. Back in Detroit, I got my old job back. Different this time. They called me consultant. Gave me an office with a window and a phone that actually worked. But I didn't sit still. I started writing a new series of specs. Not for tanks this time, but for the men who built them. Simple systems, safer tools, smarter layouts. Because if I'd learned anything, it was this. You don't win wars by doing what's easy. You win by doing what's right, even when it costs you. And sometimes, just sometimes, doing what's right actually works. This chapter wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And maybe, just maybe, a small crack in the wall finally letting the truth get through. But we're not done yet. There's still one piece left, and it's the one that could bring it all full circle. I didn't expect a medal. Didn't expect a ceremony, a flag, or a handshake. To be honest, I didn't even expect to walk back through the front gate at Aberdeen. But war has a funny way of circling back to the folks it once pushed out. And when I walked into that hangar again, 2 years older, 10 years angrier, everything smelled the same. Grease, dust, burnt coffee, The only difference was this time they didn't stop me at the door. They nodded. Some even stood. The modified M4, or Variant 12 as they'd rebranded it, was lined up like a row of stubborn mules, ready to kick the mud out of anything that got in their way. The design was mine. The armor improvements. Ours, the changes under the hood. Born in back rooms and basements by men who got paid in silence. And now the army was producing them in batches. They didn't use my name. Of course not. They called it an internal upgrade. But I knew the truth. And so did the crews who saw the difference the moment they got behind the wheel. In late 44, I was sent overseas. Not as a soldier, not as a journalist, as an observer. They didn't say much about what that meant. Just gave me papers, put me on a ship, and said I'd be moving with a unit in France. It was cold, wet, loud in a way you don't forget. Steel clanging, orders shouted, engines growling like they were angry to be alive. I met the tank crews, real ones, young guys with dirt in their teeth, and that 1,000-yard look that said they'd seen too much. Too fast. I kept my mouth shut, just listened. One night, while sitting around a small fire, one of them, corporal, maybe 20, said, "Man, this new model doesn't choke. We hit a ditch this morning that would have swallowed our last ride whole." Another added, "Transmission held tight. Felt like someone finally gave a damn." I didn't say a word. But in that moment, sitting on a crate in the freezing dark, I felt warmer than I had in years. A few days later, I saw it firsthand. A German 88 lit up the tree line. Direct hit on the lead tank. Boom! Dust everywhere. Everyone flinched. But when the smoke cleared, the tank was still there. Engine stalled for a second, then growled back to life. It reversed. Swung left. Took cover. The crew made it. That's when I saw the reinforced armor plate. The same design they once said was too experimental. After the battle, I checked the tank myself. Hands on cold steel. Scorch marks, scratches, but no breach. One of the mechanics, a young black sergeant from Chicago, looked at me and said, "Whoever thought up this hull deserves a raise." I just smiled. "Maybe," I said, "but more than that, they deserve to know it worked." When I got back stateside, the war was winding down. Factories slowed, offices emptied, and men came home with scars the government couldn't file away. They never mentioned the Nevada tests again, never acknowledged the leak, never printed a correction. But one day, a lieutenant I'd worked with in California sent me a box. Inside was a patch. Torn, dirty, faded. It had been sewn onto the uniform of a tank operator who survived a direct hit during the push into Germany. Tucked in the corner was a note. He said to give this to whoever made that tank hold. I kept it. Didn't frame it. Didn't brag about it. Just slipped it into a drawer next to the original sketches and the old welding gloves. I still visit the plant sometimes. Not to work. Not anymore. Just to walk the floor. Listen to the sound of machines that no longer ignore the lives riding on their backs. Sometimes I meet new hires. Kids who never heard my name, never knew the fight behind the frame. That's fine. History's full of people who stood in the shadows so others could walk through the door. I don't need credit. I don't need applause. But I'll tell you what I did need, and what I finally got. Proof that doing the right thing, even when it's thankless, even when it costs you everything, still matters. that a stubborn engineer with a blueprint and a busted voice could outlast bureaucracy, outrun silence, and outbuild every doubt they ever stacked in front of him. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. This story wasn't about tanks. It was about holding the line, even when the system tells you to step back. And if this hits something deep in you, then maybe the real fight is still out there. They say history gets written by the victors, but sometimes the footnotes tell a better story. And this chapter right here, it belongs to the men whose names never made the papers. The ones who didn't get parades, who never stood behind microphones, but who held the line when it wasn't popular, wasn't safe, and sure as hell wasn't easy. I wasn't the only one. I just spoke loud enough to get noticed. But there were hundreds of us, thousands, and they were everywhere, in boiler rooms, in machine shops, under tank hatches, between gears and gunfire. They were the backbone, and we almost forgot them. Let me take you back to late 1945, war's over. At least on paper, soldiers are coming home with hollow eyes and full duffel bags. Flags are folded, families are grieving, and the factories that once roared with steel now whisper like old ghosts. I was walking through the Detroit plant one last time, not as a worker, not as a rebel, just as a man tying up loose ends. And that's when I ran into Lonnie, the janitor. Black man, maybe 65, broom in one hand, cigarette in the other, always had a blues tune on his lips and oil in his veins. He stopped me in the corridor, leaned on his mop and said, "Heard your tank made it all the way to Berlin." I smiled. "So they say. You get your name on it?" "Nope." He took a drag, chuckled through his teeth. "Doesn't matter. Just means they couldn't erase you, so they had to absorb you." I never forgot that line. They didn't hand out honors for pushing back against the system, but every once in a while, I'd hear from someone who knew. Like Benny, a welder who once worked in my rogue night shift in Pittsburgh. He called me out of the blue one winter, said his grandson was doing a school project on unsung heroes of the war. He asked, "Can I tell him about the night we built the transmission with no lights, no blueprints, and too much coffee?" I said, "Tell him we weren't heroes, just tired of watching folks get hurt by bad decisions." He paused, then said, "That is what makes you a hero." The war had ended, but the fight, it just changed uniforms. Now it was a war for dignity, for memory, for making sure people like Lonnie and Benny and Sergeant Penner weren't lost in someone else's version of history. I got invited, reluctantly I'll add, to a small recognition ceremony in D.C. They called it a technical review symposium, which is Army speak for, "We're going to pretend we appreciated you all along." They had punch, folding chairs, a speech by someone who kept mispronouncing my last name. But toward the back of the room, I saw something real. A photo. Grainy, blown up on a cheap poster board. It was our prototype, the one from Nevada. No badge, no logo, just the machine. Still standing, still powerful, still here. That was the real ceremony. A reporter cornered me afterward. Young woman, notebook full of questions, eyes sharp. She asked, "Do you regret not going public sooner?" I shook my head. I regret they made it so hard to do the right thing. Then she asked something else. "If you could speak to every soldier who rode in one of your modified tanks, what would you say?" I thought about that, longer than she expected, and then I said, "I didn't save you. You saved yourselves. I just gave the machine a chance to keep up with your courage." She nodded, wrote it down. And for the first time in years, I felt like the story might actually be told the way it happened, not the way they wanted it remembered. These days, I don't talk much. Time does that to you. But when I walk by the river near my place in Michigan, sometimes I stop and listen. I listen for the silence. The silence of men who fought, fixed, built, resisted, and were never asked for their names. The silence of engineers who stayed up all night redrawing plans they knew would be thrown out. The silence of mechanics who knew exactly how to fix the problem but got told to stay in their place. That silence isn't empty. It's full of dignity. People ask me sometimes, would you do it all again? The sleepless nights, the pushback, the black marks in your file, the doors slammed in your face, the names they called you behind closed meetings. And I always say, if it helped one man come home, yeah, I'd do it again. Twice. Because this wasn't about being right. It was about not being quiet when it mattered most. And if that's the only thing they ever remember about me, then maybe that's enough. Thanks for staying with me through every twist, every fight, every moment they said no. And we built it anyway. This wasn't just one man's story. It was ours. And maybe now, finally, it's been heard.